But welcome everyone to our 5th webinar, and this one is focused on ageism. We appreciate everyone's time and being here today to join us and to learn about this topic. I would like to let you all know that we've had a slight change in today's plan, and that Perla Gheiler is unable to join us, and at the last minute, fortunately very early this morning, Janine Vanderburg has agreed to be a panelist for us today. So thank you so much. We truly appreciate that. Thank you. And I'd like to just run through thanking all of our sponsors throughout this 5-part series of webinars that we've been conducting. And first, I'd like to thank MSU Denver's Department of Social Work for being a sponsor. Thank you so much for that. CU's Multidisciplinary Center on Aging, part of the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Thank you guys. And Seniors Resource Center, thank you so much. Innovage, thank you for your support. And Primetime News, thank you all for being supportive of us. And finally, Colorado Senior Lobby's Board of Directors. Thank all of you, of which I myself am a board member too. So thank you all for sponsoring this important series that we've held. And Bob, I'm going to hand it over to you to just kind of do an overview of the housekeeping for today's agenda.
Okay, well, most of the people on this call have probably been on previous calls, but we ask you to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions that you have that come up during the presentations. And the chat box is still available as well, but I prefer the Q&A for questions. We are recording this, at least we're supposed to be. So I'll make sure that happens. And I want to thank the planning team as well, which is Chris, who you've heard from already, Jody Waterhouse, Kelly Roberts, Rich Morrow, Corinne Hall, Jeanette Hensley. And with that, thank you to the panelists, and take it away, Chris. This is yours.
Thank you, Bob. All right, so I'll just introduce each panelist and then let them go in depth about who they are and the work that they're doing. So first we have Janine Vanderburg, the Director of Changing the Narrative, and Christian Eteen, who is a professor in the Department of Social Work at MSU Denver and also the current chair with the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. And third, we have Adela Flores-Brennan, the Executive Director at Colorado Consumer Health Initiative. Adela, I don't believe is here yet, but hopefully
she's here.
Oh, good. All right. Oh, welcome, Adela. I'm glad you're here. Thank you. All right. So to the three of you, and we'll go in this order. We'll have Janine, then Christian, and then Adela answer. But we'd love to hear from each of you to describe what your organization does or organizations do, and a little background about the work that you're involved with, and anything you'd like to just share about yourself, your work, and your organization. So we'll start with Janine. Thanks.
Okay, Chris and Colorado Senior Lobby friends, thanks so much for having me. So Changing the Narrative is a partnership of Rose Community Foundation and Next 50 Initiative, and our big grand goal is to end ageism. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be talking about how the pandemic and ageism have intersected. What we try to do is change the way people think, talk, and act about aging, about older people, and increase awareness of ageism. And we do that a number of strategies. So I think many of you here have been involved in one of our workshops on reframing aging. So we put forth the work that was developed by the Frameworks Institute on what are evidence-based ways of talking about older people, about talking about aging-related issues that actually change hearts and minds in a positive direction and support the kind of policies that I know many of you are advocating for. We do broader community organizing and education. So we do workshops for older people on how we ourselves can become change agents and work in our communities and in our everyday lives to address ageism. We do workshops and presentations for businesses and workforce centers on the value that older workers bring to community, to workforce, into the economy. We have started doing a workshop that's actually geared at older job seekers and career changers, to also, many of whom start feeling defeated after getting so many no's. So we do work with them on how to position yourself and how to use principles of reframing. So that's kind of the community education and organizing work that we do. We do a lot of on social media. We do what we call specialized campaigns. So right now we are in the middle of an anti-ageism birthday card campaign. So as an alternative to all of those cards that are out there that say, oh, you're over the hill, et cetera, actually starting when you're 21 or 30 or 40, we have commissioned 20 Colorado artists to create alternatives that actually celebrate instead of denigrate aging. And so we've just selected the artists. They're starting to produce their design. So in early November, we'll have a suite of cards that we'll be publicizing. We also had done a real photo contest. So I think all of us who have been involved in trying to put together websites or collateral typically see the very stereotypical images of older people, the one that are either very sad looking out the window, hoping that somebody is going to come by, or the ones, you know, those pharmaceutical ad version where we're on the beach and the glass of champagne, and not really talking about the reality of most people who are older being involved, like all of you are, you know, in community and workforce, starting businesses, involved with grandchildren, et cetera. So we did a real photo contest, and you can find those real photos of real people on the Next 50 Initiative website. And then we do research and policy. And here's kind of the lens at which we do it. We started out by compiling research done by others, for example, on the benefits of older workers to a workforce, and kind of synthesizing those and sharing those. And we also have been doing some original research. So, and I wish I had the results ready today, so I'll have to come back. We've commissioned a research study of people in Colorado age 50 over, and what their experiences are with relationship to workforce, to job seeking, kind of during this pandemic, post-pandemic economy. And we had over 1,200 people respond. So really, really good sample size from across Colorado. And so we're doing some of that original research to help inform policy, whether it's policy advocacy that SAPCA is doing at Colorado Senior Lobby, that it can be done reflecting the voices of older Coloradans. So that's kind of some of the work that we do. Oh, and then Chris, how could I forget this? We also, one of the things that we know about ageism, and a really effective way to counter it, is having intergenerational conversations. So last year we did those in person, and Chris actually headed that project up. And this year we have done those virtually. So we did a PBS series on it. Chris created a virtual toolkit so that anyone can download from our website. So you can have an intergenerational conversation about how we experience ageism, both as younger people and as older people. And we also currently are involved in a partnership with Building Bridges to train some of our volunteer change agents on the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion issues as they apply to gender and race, and what the intersection is with age. So we're training a group of people, and Chris as well is heading up that project. Chris, you should have jumped in there. So that's some of the stuff we do. I probably missed some things, but anyway.
No.
But again, thanks for being here. This is our favorite topic, because we're trying to get ageism.
True. Thank you, Janine. And also I wanted to congratulate Janine and let everyone know that Janine has just been awarded a fellowship from Encore.org and the Op-Ed Project with her work in ageism, which is it's a national, they're international?
International, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a really big deal. So I'm
really excited to write about all the cool stuff that all of us are trying to advance.
Thank you. All right, so thank you, Janine, and I'll introduce Christiane and take it away.
Great, thanks. It's so good to be here. So I'll speak first about SAPCA, the Colorado Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging, and sort of how we've addressed ageism, which we've encountered from the very beginning in 2015. For those of you who don't know, SAPCA was put into place by the state legislature in 2015 to develop a strategic plan for the state of Colorado to address the changing demographics and the implications for the society as a whole to make Colorado a better place to age. And so within that, one of the pieces within the forming statute was looking at workforce, both the workforce for older adults, but the workforce of older adults, and included in that was also the volunteer sector. And I chaired the workforce subcommittee for about 2.5 years as sort of that in the first parts of this. And a big part of what we focused on in terms of addressing ageism was changing who is at the table when we look at workforce issues. So historically, age has not been an active part of what the Workforce Development Council has looked at. And in fact, when we raised these issues, they said, well, that's a special population, even though much of what's in the workforce is geared through K through 12 and higher ed, which they don't see as a special population. So inherent in that statement is the ageism, age bias, implicit bias around what age is and what it means. So one of our first recommendations was that we needed to get somebody on to the Workforce Development Council, that is the body that oversees the whole infrastructure within the state of Colorado for addressing workforce issues. And we needed an older voice perspective on there. And so that was one of our first recommendations. And within a year, we got somebody on there. And that group has now created a subgroup within it to look at age-related issues in the workforce. And we see those as two big steps forward in beginning to change the conversation, to use Janine's term, to change the narrative that folks are having, where age becomes a part of how we address things and how we look at things. There have been other places that ageism has clearly come in. We saw it very clearly, and I know we're going to get into more specifics around the pandemic, but certainly in the way that the state has responded to the pandemic, I think raised concerns about how age was being considered. Our vision for Colorado is a state where folks can age in place for as long as they choose to, and in the way that they choose to. And that means that you're able to go to work, you're able to go to the store, you're able to do those things. And the degree to which stay-at-home orders only applied to those over a certain age is not in the spirit of our recommendations. So those are some of the ways, and we can certainly get into more specifics. From the perspective of MSU Denver, and I sit on the Strategic Action Planning Group as my role as an educator representing higher ed in the place of aging. And higher ed has two, I think, again, important places within aging and ageism, therefore. One is we provide a workforce that will ultimately serve many folks directly in healthcare-related fields, but also indirectly in all the other areas that older adults engage in, including business. We produce a lot of business majors at MSU Denver, but through higher ed in general, we produce lots of folks. My department is social work, and we produce a lot of social workers who are going to work in aging-related fields. Those of you who may or may not know, MSU Denver is the most ethnically diverse campus in the state of Colorado. We recently became a Hispanic serving institution, which means more than 20% of our students are Hispanic. And those pieces mean that one of the things that I think we do a really good job is looking at issues of inclusion and social and economic justice across the university. That's particularly a major focus of social work. Embedded in that is the intersection of age and race, which we know has, again, also been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And so in those ways, we engage in it. I will say that age and aging still remains probably the least of the focuses within that sector of social equity. As we might expect, there is certainly a lack of focus sometimes in that arena. The other place that MSU Denver, I think, is the most unique campus is that not only are we diverse in terms of ethnicity, we are also the oldest campus in the sense of our student population. We have one of the older demographics. It's not uncommon for us to have students across campus who are 50 plus. And not in encore careers necessarily, but often first generation students finally going back to school. So it's a real wide range. We certainly do have encore folks as well, but and certainly in social work, we know that to be an encore career, we have lots of folks who come at 40 to 50 to 60 years old to get back either for a BSW or MSW. So those are some of the ways that we're involved in aging.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing all that. It was very good information to hear. Thank you. And so now I'll introduce Adele. Do you like to be called Adele or Adela? I want to make sure I'm doing it correctly.
It's Adela. I will go ahead and I just noticed the misspelling of my name.
Okay.
Windows, so I'll go ahead and fix that here in a second.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And please take as much time as you need to share what the work you're doing and what your experience is. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to see all of you this morning. My name is Adela Flores-Brennan, and I am the Executive Director of the Colorado Consumer Health Initiative. We are a statewide healthcare advocacy organization with a membership base, and we focus on consumer health-related issues in an effort to create a more equitable, affordable, and quality healthcare system. A lot of the work that we do centers on ensuring that people have access to healthcare, that there is value in that healthcare, and that it's affordable. We do a lot of policy work at the Capitol and also at the regulatory agencies. We focus quite a bit at the Division of Insurance, which is definitely an acquired taste doing insurance regulation work. And then we have recently, in 2018, created a consumer assistance program. And that program is a direct service for anybody in the state of Colorado. We've served, I think, over 36 counties so far, who is having any kind of difficulty navigating the healthcare system, whether it's a large unexpected bill, an uninsured client who accessed the healthcare system and doesn't have the ability to pay and needs charity care, somebody who can't afford their prescriptions. So we're able to help identify financial assistance programs, help people get connected to Medicaid if that seems appropriate. We also call up providers on the phone with our clients and help negotiate bills and payment plans, or get those bills pulled out of collections if possible. So there's a pretty wide range of work that we do on behalf of clients. We also will help just provide a set of suggestions for how people can navigate themselves, and sometimes that's sufficient for helping an individual who feels like they are able to, if they just have a little bit of a hint or a little bit of a push, they can do it themselves. But certainly we can provide much more hands-on service as well. The range of issues that we've worked on over the last 20 years, we're celebrating our 20th year. Actually next week is our anniversary celebration, has been around health reform in a way that increases the number of people who can access the system and how affordable that can be. So we're really paying attention right now to protecting the Affordable Care Act, protecting Medicaid, and also looking for gaps in the system and how we can correct for those gaps and increase the number of people who are covered through insurance and have access to health care.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that important work that you're doing at CCHI. Okay, so I'll go to Janine next with our first question for you. And there's like 3 parts within this, so go at it whichever direction you want, Janine. But why should we all be aware of ageism and its impacts? What are those impacts? And how does the existing crisis standards of care guideline correlate with ageism? So however you want to tackle that. You're muted. You're muted. Sorry.
That's a big question. How much time do I have? Okay. Why should we all care about ageism? So let's first start by defining what ageism is. And I like the World Health Organization definition because I think it's the sharpest and clearest. And it's basically prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination based on age. So prejudice, you know what? I just don't like old people. Stereotyping, people who are older aren't willing to learn and they're digitally incompetent. And then actual discrimination, I'll start talking about the crisis standards of care. Actual discrimination is when you say that someone, because of a certain age, gets additional scoring points, and additional scoring points move you to the back of the triage line. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Why should we all care about ageism? You know, it's the one ism that we are all going to face if we are not successful in ending it. The one thing that all of us in this session have in common is today for each one of us, it's the oldest we've ever been, and think about this tonight before you go to sleep, it's the youngest you will ever be. If we are fortunate, we will wake up tomorrow morning older, which means that we are likely to experience ageism. And I do want to be sure to mention that ageism can also be directed against younger people as well. So if someone is running around saying someone's an entitled millennial, or they are discounting and not giving someone an opportunity because they're younger, that's ageism as well. But for this purpose, we'll talk about ageism directed against older people. And the impacts are really well documented. So one, I want to talk about prevalence. A study that was released in July showed that 82% of Americans between the ages of 50 and 80 experience some form of everyday ageism, 82%. We know that a study by the Urban Institute showed the impact on age discrimination in the workplace. 56% of people who entered their 50s with stable employment, meaning they had been employed for at least 5 years, 56% were either pushed out or laid off, and only 10% ever recouped financially. So there are obviously financial impacts on experienced age discrimination. A series of studies by Dr. Becca Levy of the Yale School of Public Health also shows incredibly negative health impacts. So if we have age negative attitudes about ourselves aging, which is really likely, right, because we're surrounded by the ageism, we have shortened lifespan, we have poorer health outcomes. On the other hand, if we are able to cultivate age positive attitudes about ourselves aging, those kind of flip. One study showed that in a control group, having age positive attitudes resulted in people having an increased lifespan of 7.5 years. And another study showed 49.7% less likely to develop dementia, even among people with a genetic marker for Alzheimer's, by having those age positive attitudes, which are obviously really difficult to develop when we are surrounded by ageism. There's also incredible negative impacts on the economy. So I know often among aging advocates like ourselves, Colorado Senior Lobby and others, we talk a lot about budget impacts and, you know, what are the budget impacts of things that maybe are being proposed to the legislature. And I think it's really important to note that studies by AARP released earlier this year showed that the economic impact of ageism in the workplace, $850 billion a year in the US. Another study by the Yale School of Public Health showed $63 billion in annual healthcare costs due to ageism. So when we're talking about kind of like the cost of things, we need to make sure that we understand what the cost of ageism are. Those are some of the impacts. So let me go to one of my, as you all know, favorite topics, Colorado's crisis standards of care. And I'm still hoping that all of us here who have the power to do this can persuade the state to change those crisis standards of care before we get further into fall and winter, with the likelihood that the governor warned last week of increased hospitalization. So Colorado's crisis standards of care have a scoring mechanism that to me is the perfect indicator both of explicit ageism, and I'll describe that in a moment, but also implicit racism. And to me, it's a great example of how very well-meaning and well-intentioned and very smart people, because of the ageism that surrounds all of us and because of our own implicit ageism, can develop standards that have a very negative impact on all of us as we age. So here's what Colorado's crisis standards of care call for in terms of triage. If we get to a situation and there is a surge in hospital beds, not just because of the surge might be because of COVID-19, but people could be entering the hospital for any reason. It could be flu, it could be a heart attack, whatever. But if there is a surge and a lack of capacity in hospital, in ICU beds, in ventilators, in access even to the medical professionals, here's what Colorado standards call for. That there would first be a look at immediate survivability, and that's very similar to standards in many states. But then there's this tier 2, and tier 2 is something called a modified Charlson index, and here's what it currently calls for. And the goal, keep in mind, this is really important to understand, the goal is to have the fewest points. If you have the fewest points, you get the access to the healthcare resource.
Hey, Janine,
Janine,
yeah. Real quick, do you want me to show that? I have it on my screen.
Yeah, you could absolutely go ahead and I will just keep talking. That would be great. Thank you.
All right, there you go.
Thank you, Bob, for doing that. Oh, perfect. Bob, I didn't know you were going to do this. How handy. So you can see here that if you're under age 50, you have 0 points. But starting at age 50 and for every decade after, you get another point. So that's very clearly explicit ageism, right? You get points and you get moved to the back of the line based on your age. And then we look at all of these comorbidities, which is both then some implicit ageism and also implicit racism. So we know because of systemic health disparities that have been experienced over a lifespan, that people of color are more likely to have some of the heart diseases mentioned, diabetes, etc. But you get additional points for that. And we also know that the likelihood of comorbidities, it also becomes greater as you get older, but especially for people of color. So we currently have in Colorado this Charlson Index, which will determine who moves to the front of the triage line and who moves to the back. And right now in Colorado, who will move to the back are older people and people of color if we reach that surge in hospitalizations that some are predicting for this fall and winter. What have other states done about this? So it started out very similar in California, but aging advocates like ourselves raised our voices, and this kind of scoring was eliminated. The US Office of Civil Rights in many states has said that systems like this violate federal civil rights law. So this is an example of ageism that is baked into our systems that though all of us as advocates can join forces and approach, Department of Public Health and Environment, the governor, whoever, and just say, we got to get rid of this. Colorado can do better. We know a lot more about the pandemic than we did when these were developed, and we know a lot more about the impacts on people of color. So this to me is a perfect example. And I like to quote Maya Angelou, when we know better, we can do better. This is the perfect opportunity now for Colorado to do better. So, but that's how Colorado's crisis standards of care correlate with ageism. Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
All right. I think I've answered your questions. Have I? I'm looking.
Definitely. Thank you, Janine. Thank you for that. That was great information to share. I'm glad you were able to show that. And thanks, Bob, for getting that graphic up. That was definitely helpful. So Adela.
Chris, real quick too. If any of you who are on the line here want to see these crisis standards of care, I'm happy to send them to you. So just send me a chat and let me know, and I'll shoot them to you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So Adela, so in whatever way you'd like to share this, but we're curious about some issues that are involving older Coloradans that CCHI is focusing on maybe this year or into next year, any of the policies that you're all looking at that may impact older adults. And even if it's in the realm of like caregiver support and things like that, but whatever you'd like to share with that, we'd love to hear it.
Thanks. Yeah, so there's a few things that we're focusing on for the coming year that I think have the potential to have an impact on older adults. And that has to do with something that's kind of baked into how we calculate insurance rates. As we age, the insurance rates are weighted 3 to 1 based on age. for premiums. And so we see that people who are 50 and older, especially as we approach Medicare age, the cost of insurance gets to be really expensive. So there's a couple of things that we are looking at that may help with the cost or affordability of healthcare. One is the ability for Colorado to create some sort of public option that would compete against the private insurance or commercial insurance products and be more affordable for people who are purchasing that product. The other place that we're looking at focusing our attention is on the cost of prescription drugs. There are a couple of efforts that we've been supporting over the last couple of years that focus on both the transparency of drug costs, but also there is one that we will be supporting coming up this year that looks at creating a prescription drug affordability board. And that board would be given the authority to look at the cost of prescription drugs, maybe either the overall cost or the percentage increase year over year, and help to advise on setting a cap for how much prescription drugs can cost year over year. Another big priority for us, and I mentioned Medicaid earlier. Medicaid is just a critically important part of our healthcare system. It helps lower income individuals in the state, and it also helps older adults who are lower income, and then anyone who is requiring some sort of home and community-based supports. It's really important. And there's a couple of ways that Medicaid is facing maybe some challenges. One is the budget. The state budget is facing an enormous challenge with the pandemic-related recession that we've seen and the lack of revenue that's coming into the state. So when we see such a significant lack of revenue or decrease in revenue, then we can expect to have to face and perhaps defend against cuts to various programs. So that's one thing that we'll be keeping our eye on for the 2021 legislative session. And then depending on how things go during the federal or during the elections in November at the federal level, we'll be paying attention to anything that might serve to jeopardize the Medicaid program moving forward. So those are just a few of the things that we're looking at both at the state and federal level.
Thank you, Adela. Great information. Thanks so much. Okay, so Christiane, I'll go to you. And if you'd like to share some information on how COVID has impacted the work that you're doing with SAPCA and also maybe even at MSU Denver.
So I'll start where Janine was in terms of the standards of care, because SAPCA did play a role, and one of the important ways we played a role is that we actually had several meetings with the state epidemiologist. They were part of our public forum. And in those, we sought to gain better clarity on the actual demographics and statistics of what is really happening with the pandemic. So if you look at the stay-at-home orders and at the standards of care, it talks about 60 plus. Well, that is potentially a 40 to 50 year span of ages, from 60 to 100 plus. If we took that same approach at the younger end, we would be talking about 0 to 40 or 50. And we know we don't take those broad brush strokes. And so we had a sense that the way the statistics were being presented skewed things consistent with an ageist view. And so we sought clarification both on congregate care and how many folks were actually perishing within congregate care, and a better, clearer breakdown of ages between 60 and 70, 70 to 80, 80 plus, recognizing that those distinctions. And we were able to get that and within congregate care. And looking at that, it further convinced us that the recommendations were incongruent with data and with perspective. And so we actually did a special letter to the governor and the state legislature suggesting that the current way that standards of care are articulated are inconsistent, and the stay-at-home orders with those pieces. So we haven't seen movement on that, but we took action to make recommendations based on better data analysis, if you will, and pushing the state to do that. And we've done that throughout also. So speaking of workforce pieces, that's another place that we have historically pushed the workforce data to be better segmented, especially as we talk about older workers. So historically, it's talked about 50 plus. Again, we know that workers are staying in the workforce easily till 75. And we wanted greater clarity as to what are those percentages in the workforce, and what are they experiencing. Because without that data, you can't have a data-informed conversation. You can't make policy recommendations that are actually based on facts rather than fiction. And so much of ageism really relies on fiction. It relies on prejudice, biases, and oftentimes unconscious biases. And so those are the pieces that I think SAPCA is continuing to do work on. I've said many times that the pandemic did not necessarily create lots of new issues. It simply magnified everything else by 10 times or more. So there were always issues about isolation. It only made it worse. There were always issues around ageism. It only made it worse. So transportation was always a challenge. It's only made it worse. And so it sort of made those problems that exist, that were that have always been the challenges that we've been attempting to address, to make Colorado a more age-friendly place to live in. And it's just put them in front of us and made them glaring. And so it's that piece that we're attempting to use in our analysis of our previous recommendations moving forward, and new areas, is looking at in what ways did it shine the light on those cracks, and can we use those cracks to better address where the changes need to come. So how are we going to move forward? And that's really about positioning. It's really about using the information and the opportunity that this crisis has produced. The Chinese symbol for crisis is danger and opportunity. And I think that in that way, we are really using, or attempting to use this as an opportunity to educate us all. I mean, because as Janine, and I use Janine a lot because she makes such wonderful points, that we are all aging, that aging is a part of reality. I think I just heard Donald Trump for the first time acknowledge that he was an older adult, which was shocking to me. I'd never heard him acknowledge that reality. We have two septenarians running for president, and yet, and both of them actually are also using ageist tropes at times in terms of the mental capacity. And so I think that these are real things that we deal with every day. From the MSU Denver side, I mean, I think that what COVID has done and the pandemic has done is again shown some of our weaknesses and some of the areas that we struggle with. Our students, by and large, are stressed. So the majority are older, working, kids, families, caretaking for older adults. I mean, all of those things are going on. And so our students are much more stressed than they've ever been. And I think that is a reality. It also challenges a lot of our external or extracurricular kinds of pieces that we know are also of service to the community. Our arts programs, our recreation programs, some of the services we provide. So those are things we provide to the general community, and those have been challenges. And I know that that's the same at the other campuses on our area, so CU Denver and the Community College of Denver, as well as all the institutions across the state. So our ability to be of service to the community has been greatly impacted because, quite frankly, we also know that many of our colleges have become hotspots as well, particularly in the month of August and September. So we're seeing upticks as a result. So those are some of the ways that the pandemic has affected the two bodies that I'm involved with.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing the information about the segmented data that you've been gathering, because that's something that I haven't seen in public information being shared so much, and wondered about that. And I'm glad to hear that you're finding it. So a question I'd actually like, that triggered me to think of a question for all three of you, because all of us are involved with advocacy and along with Colorado Senior Lobby, and getting accurate information, and just how can we as consumers be more involved in finding out accurate information, and how do we share that, or in the different areas of your work that the three of you are doing, what recommendations do you have to our audience on how they can be involved in finding accurate information, and then getting that information, or letting legislators know how they feel about it, or what can change? So feel free to jump in whatever order you'd like.
So I'm going to go ahead and start because I feel really strongly about this. I think in a way, the fact that ageism is embedded in so many systems is the reason we can't, and it's really hard to get accurate information. I really applaud Christian and SAPCA for having, CDPHE come in and say, and really asking good questions about the data. We don't have a lot of good data. Some of the data, for example, that has been collected by people, again, who are really good researchers, but when they did research on workforce data, they stopped collecting at age 65, even though that we know that 1 in 4, before the pandemic, 1 in 4 Coloradans age 65 and over was in the workforce. So this is a reason that, at Changing the Narrative, we said, we need to find out what's going on with older workers because we don't have good data. So we will be, releasing by the end of this month, a really comprehensive, in-depth study on what workers age 50, workers and job seekers age 50 and over are experiencing. But so I think recommendations is one, we're going to have to collect our own data. We're going to have to do what SAPCA is doing, and asking people who have access to the data to produce it. And I think the third thing, this to me is where aging advocates in groups like Colorado Senior Lobby and CCHI can say, when any of our research and policy shops, when the state is doing studies, we need to make sure that including data about people, older people, is part of the study, and that we don't make assumptions like, well, people retire at age 65, and therefore when we're doing workforce studies, we're not going to include people age of 65 and older. And that's just like one small example. But even studies, for example, around economic security and other things frequently have not included older people. So we've got to, one of my favorite sayings, it's in my email signature, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. So it's going to be us. We've got to be the people. We can't count on someone, the cavalry, showing up. We've got to be the people who are demanding the data, and if we can't get it, doing our own data collection.
Thanks, Janine. Adela, did you want to, or Christian, you want to add to that topic?
I think so. One of the things that I think is really interesting about ageism in the workforce is that not unlike our presidents, but many CEOs, many folks at the higher rungs are older. Or 65 plus. Many boards of directors are made of folks. So I think that one of the pieces that we need to also really consider is the intersection, the disproportionality of those in lower paid jobs. And this is why the pandemic has again further shined a light on older adults in the workforce who are in lower paid jobs. These are jobs you generally can't do from home. You can't do via video conferencing. And so those workers have been disproportionately affected. And so we have to look at age in the context of race, gender, and social and economic status. It's really the intersection of these 4 pieces that disproportionately affect ageism. The other piece from a statistical perspective is that, and we've struggled with this at SAPCA, is that the data around actual age discrimination as a result of ageism is really challenging because so few cases are filed and so few cases are successful. Because proving ageism is one of the most challenging of the protected classes that are out there. And we've heard this directly from folks in the state that this is a challenge. So we have laws, but enforcing those laws becomes really challenging. And so I think that it's about us advocating that and taking a perspective that we have to look at all of these things simultaneously. And I do think that we need to recognize that as older adults, we have tremendous economic and political power. The AARP's reports on the economic impact of older adults in terms of the state of Colorado is staggering. I mean, I think it's about 25% of the economy, if I'm right. Somebody may have those numbers more at their fingertips, but that economic capacity means that we have a voice to share. And I think that it is about time we start making those demands upon society and organizing. I mean, many of us have jokingly said it's time for the Great Panthers to come back. I mean, it's time for an advocacy piece that really puts on par with Black Lives Matter, because it's not just Black lives, it's older Black lives that matter. It's really the intersection of those pieces. So those are some of the pieces that, for me, when I think about advocacy, come to mind.
Thank you, Christiane and Adela.
Yeah, I think that the intersectionality piece is something that we're starting to work on just in the very early stages right now with some of our partner advocacy organizations as we reflect on how much data, disaggregated data is available and how much is not, especially by race. And then if you get into by race and ethnicity, starting to break it down even further, you lose statistical significance. But how can we be asking those questions without, there's a, if you think about asking those questions, are you further putting somebody into a box? And so we are also thinking about how do we ask questions and ask people to self-identify without perpetuating systems of racism or other systems, which is something that we're exploring right now and thinking about as we look to find increasing data sets or building the data sets that we need to really do the analysis and the evaluation of how we're doing as a system. I will say, there's a lot of really good healthcare related data sets out there. We rely very heavily on the Colorado Health Institute and the CHAS data, the Health Access Survey that they do every 2 years. That's been a really important local source of data, and they are able to break that down by age, and that's really helpful because they'll look at 50 to 64 and then 65 plus. I think another thing that's important to recognize is that we shouldn't just stop thinking about health care affordability data when people hit 65. Yes, 99% of folks in Colorado at least are insured by Medicare when they hit 65, but that doesn't mean that affordability has been attained. A lot of people don't have the income and wherewithal to afford the cost sharing under Medicare, and I find it to be enormously frustrated that there's so little at the state level that we've been able to do so far to help support folks. So anyway, I'll stop there.
No, thank you for that. So I'd like to see Rich or Bob, if you've been monitoring questions and if there are any questions that have come in that we want to share.
Oh, this is Rich. All three questions I have in the question and answers are from the same person. So we can you guys on the panel see the questions or not? The first one talks about, I believe, challenges that we've had with providing access to older adults in various settings during the pandemic, and I think calling out some differences in how we respond to that, maybe making access for students through technology more so than we have for connecting older adults. Maybe let's start with that one. Does anybody want to jump in and talk about that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to chat about that a bit. That to me is a perfect example of kind of the implicit bias against older people, that implicit ageism. I don't think anyone sat around and said, oh, well, you know, we're going to give technology access to younger people and we're not going to give it to older people, but not even sort of consideration as we were thinking about how do we address this collectively. So there's been a lot of conversation in words that I don't like during the pandemic that really set back of the movement to view older people as valued resources to community. And one of them is the term weak, vulnerable, elderly, right? We hear that again and again from our public health officials, our elected officials. And the idea is we need to protect our weak, vulnerable, elderly. And really, to me, what's vulnerable is not older people. What's vulnerable is a society that doesn't recognize that social isolation is really damaging to people of all ages, that all of us, to thrive through a pandemic, need access to technology and think about, you know, more systemic solutions, like how do we close the digital divide? Even when we are providing some technology access for younger people, we haven't thought about it. And I've seen this a lot, and I think all of us who've been on Zoom have seen this a lot. To me, the most vulnerable person, if you will, is the parent who is trying to do his or her Zoom meetings. And by the way, here's the kid over here trying to do their kind of Zoom or whatever virtual classrooms. And so we haven't thought through collectively of how do we make this work for all of us. So I think it's sort of a long-winded answer, but I think because we are not thinking about collective solutions, that bundled with implicit bias against older people. I mean, I think it's the same sort of thinking or lack of being deliberate about is something ageist that led, you know, an initial policy decision that child protective workers were essential and adult protective workers weren't. There's simply a degree of implicit bias. And so one of the things that all of us can do, and I'm jumping ahead, Chris, to another question that you wanted us to answer, you know, what can the legislature do? What can we all do? We can, as individuals, we can test ourselves for implicit bias, and I'll share a resource in the chat, but we can also ask that the legislature on a really macro level look at proposed legislation or any kind of policy solutions with a lens of, does this express, you know, bias against older people? We need to be aware of ageism, and we need to make sure that our policies don't inadvertently perpetuate it, including policies that provide technology to younger people and not to older people.
Any of the other panelists want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit, Rich. So from SAPCA's perspective, we've also held a number of different, in our meetings, we had folks from the crisis response team come in to explore what was really happening with respect to access to congregate care, not just for families, but also ombudsmen were also not having access to those facilities. And so we did some greater in-depth exploration into what is really happening, because that was one of the things that was not clear. We've also looked at broadband. When we look and talk about social isolation, one of the things that always comes up is connectivity, and then closely connected with that is the degree to which broadband is available. So we've done some looking at how do we help address, because broadband is at the heart, if you will, the trunk line of accessibility for, as Janine put it, for younger and older, for everyone in a community. It's a universal access piece. And so we've certainly taken that perspective. When we talk about age-friendly communities, building a park or building a sidewalk is age-friendly for whether you are, 2 or whether you are 202. No one's made it that far yet, but someday. And so it really is about approaching it from that perspective. I'm going to take off both my hats and say, I think one of the things that we really need to look at in this is funding. It never ceases to sort of shock me in some ways that every ballot initiative that seems to come forward is about K through 12 schools. I've yet to see anything for that is more universal in its perspective. And we are building all of these school buildings that, quite honestly, in 20 years are going to sit empty, because if our demographic data goes in the direction it's heading, we are not going to have that many youth. But we are going to have that many folks who are older. And are we thinking about buildings that can be repurposed and multi-purposed and are multi-generational to start with? We build these buildings that sit empty for hours of the day and for months of the year. This just doesn't seem to be a really thoughtful way. So I think that even our good intentions could be more universal in the way we're thinking about things. So. And that's a Christianity teen thought, not a Sabbath.
Did you want to add anything, Adela?
I don't think I can follow up those two. Anything better than what they said.
Actually, I might, if I can take a personal privilege for a minute on that too, from some direct experience, I think, add that I've understood the area agencies on aging sort of taken the lead on some of this as well on their own, in terms of having to redesign their service delivery models when they can't, under stay-at-home orders and so forth, go into people's homes or deliver meals to them directly or whatever, or have them come to adult daycare centers. They've had to pivot to reassurance calls, and in some cases actually obtained approval to be able to spend some of their money on buying hardware like iPads and things like that. And I've seen some assisted living, and I'm not sure about nursing homes, but I've seen in assisted living where they've done that too, so that families can do a Zoom or a FaceTime or something like that with their parent or grandparent in the facility. But it also goes back to what Christiane said about the connectivity issue, and they can spend the money to buy somebody an iPad, but they can't spend their money to help them pay for the service, let alone whether or not the service is even available in their community. So there are still additional issues for that. All right, so we've got some additional questions on medical care from folks with geriatric experience and training, and this is an issue that Senior Lobby ran a bill on last year and is planning to run a bill on again this coming year to provide loan forgiveness. So I'll see if anyone wants to jump in on that one with that maybe sort of another workforce related, different perspective but on workforce related issues. Does anybody want to talk about that one?
I would just say, I think so. There is the bill that Senior Lobby has been pushing forward on geriatric care. I do think that one of the things that we need to look at is there's a much broader workforce, and our recommendations have suggested that the state look at supporting workforce development across all sectors that intersect with aging. So that is social work, it is physical therapy, it's speech therapy, it's all of these other related pieces, and all of them are going to need additional recruitment of folks. And what we know, and I can say this as a professor in social work, is that aging tends to be our smallest cohort of folks who are interested in that population. and this is probably true in every profession, people come with an interest in what they know, and that tends to be younger people. And so there is a recruitment issue across the board, and I think that loan forgiveness and other sorts of programs that would help incentivize folks to explore and be open, because once they do, our experiences, they go, this is a great population to work with. And that's universal. And so I think that that's a place where we could help by encouraging programs that would incentivize folks to look at those as possible places for employment.
I think I would just add, if I could, when we were doing some work together with the Bell Policy Center on aging issues, one of the things that came to light is also the wages that are offered to people who are working in home health or other caretaking type professions. You can, right now, I remember somebody saying that he could have, in the Denver metro area or just outside the Denver metro area, gotten a job at Good Times that was going to pay more than what they were able to pay locally for home health. And so I think it's definitely a matter of loan forgiveness and residency type programs. And it's also for these different folks who are in the workforce to support older adults, looking for ways that we can help increase those wages so people are making a living wage doing those jobs.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There does seem to be another, I don't know if comes under the implicit bias or what, it does seem to be this assumption that if you're going into a second career or whatever, wanting to take a job after you turn 60 or 65, there's sort of this assumption that you should be willing to accept lower pay based on that circumstance. And that is a problem that needs to be addressed. How about the question relating to Jeanette's question on lack of affordable hearing aids, where that's an issue that affects a lot of older adults more than other demographics. But we do, and I think we've seen as well in our work at Dr. Cog, we've got long waiting lists for people wanting hearing aids. So do you have any ideas on how to combat that problem? We can always ask for more money from the legislature, but this is probably not a good time to do that. Is there any other ideas you have?
My memory on hearing aids is that Medicare does not cover hearing aids. Is that correct? Yeah, I'm seeing Christian nod his head. I think that's a big problem, and that's not a state advocacy issue, but it could definitely be a federal advocacy issue. So we ought to be talking to our members of Congress about making the changes that would have Medicare covering that. It doesn't make a bit of sense. I would have to forgive my ignorance. I don't know if Medicaid covers hearing aids or not, but I imagine that they probably do if they're medically necessary. But I think that would be something that I'd be very much interested in putting heads together in coalition to figure out how we could address that. I know it is going to be a really difficult year for anything that has a fiscal note attached to it in the legislature, but there may be other creative solutions that we could be coming up with.
Janine, did you want to add anything on that?
So agreeing obviously with Adela that, it seems to me like a federal advocacy issue. As someone receiving Medicare, I'm constantly stunned by what it doesn't cover. I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. But I also think right now, and Jeanette, this is like a really short-term solution, and I'm never one to say, oh, let's make it about philanthropy. But everybody, so many foundations have stepped up with COVID relief fund kind of things. And what occurs to me, and so what happens, right, is individual nonprofits all apply for their kind of like individual priorities. But imagine if a coalition of organizations who are on a call like this said, we've identified this as an issue in our community. everybody is talking about social isolation, and people understand that that's an issue. So imagine if a coalition of organizations came together and said, right now, we know that a big barrier to social isolation is around hearing aids, and make it kind of a COVID-19 relief issue or something, but going together and trying to get some philanthropic dollars, which might stopgap.
Okay.
I do want to talk about, I think Phil asked a question about specific legislation, and Chris, I don't know if that's
Jump in on that. Yep.
a question. Okay. So, so some of us, I think on this call, have been working with Bell Policy Center on their actionable aging agenda, right? And in the workforce arena, which is arena that I've really been focused on, and one of the reasons that I've been focused on is in 2018 and 2019, most of my job at Changing the Narrative involved traveling around the state, doing workshops for people across Colorado. And universally, the thing that I heard the most from older Coloradans themselves, not for advocates like us, but from, older Coloradans, the consumers, was we want jobs. We need, we are experiencing workplace discrimination. We have been pushed out. We are getting those, lower salaries. We don't have enough to live on. I've shared this story with many people. I was in Mesa County with Lisa Sullivan from Next 50 Initiative. We were doing a workshop and a lunch and learn. And people, there were literally older women there stuffing leftover food in their tote bags. And when I had a further conversation with them after, the conversation was about, we need to work. They were my age. They were living on, $500 a month in Social Security. And this, despite the fact that at the time there were help wanted ads, right? So we know that age discrimination is real. We know that older Coloradans, many need to work. Some want to work, but many need to work. And so what two specific things that I would like to see in legislation in 2021, which don't have that heavy fiscal note. So it's not like asking for money to provide these services. We could eliminate age identifiers from job applications, and we know that that would have significant impact. So right now it is illegal to ask job candidates for their age, but it's not illegal to ask them for their high school graduation date, right? And we know that that's, for most people, high school graduation date is approximate for your age. We could also strengthen age discrimination laws. Christian mentioned earlier, it is a lot harder in federal law, and Colorado generally mirrors federal law. It's a lot harder to prove age discrimination than it is to prove race or sex discrimination. And so we need to change that. We need to strengthen those age discrimination laws. So those are two things that we could do without a heavy fiscal impact that would immediately start making things better for older Coloradans. And it's something that many of us on this call, if we rallied about it and made it a priority, I think we could get it done.
These are great ideas, Janine. Thanks. Let me turn it over. I think those are all the question and answers I saw.
Well, there was the one, it's less a question, Rich, it was from Gail about the Medicaid process being.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it now. Yeah.
And I guess that's another no cost piece of legislation that could potentially be run, is reducing the administrative burden that goes along with the application process for Medicaid, for home and community-based services, waivers for Medicare savings program, all of those categories. If there are ways that we could, at the state level, reduce the administrative burden that is the application process, I think those are things that,
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Potentially don't cost anything, but as we all know, those of us on the who have worked on these types of issues for a while, the cost of reprogramming that computer system is sometimes astronomical. So in theory, that could be a low cost.
Right, I understand. But actually that maybe I'll follow up on that, Adela, to keep going on that. I seem to recall in recent years, at least a couple of different efforts, maybe in other parts of the probably Medicaid world, where there was legislation to provide funding for application assistance. Are you familiar with those, and maybe could speak about those? Because that's what this sounds like, that if it doesn't exist now, that could be a worthwhile effort to try to push for application assistance?
Yeah, there's been some effort at the federal level, as some of us have been advocating with Congress for another COVID relief package. There have been efforts to encourage Congress to include more Medicaid funding coming to the state so that the state doesn't have to put forward quite so much, but also to include a payment for outreach and enrollment work. At the state level, I haven't seen much activity there, except with respect to what the Colorado's Exchange, Connect for Health Colorado, they do award contracts to their assistance network to help pay for outreach and enrollment support. But that's less about Medicaid and more about private insurance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So I'll just interject quickly that we'd like to give a little chunk of time to Christiane as our sponsor on behalf of MSU Denver's social work program. If you'd like to just maybe share a little bit about that department for everyone to represent the sponsorship. Thanks.
Yeah, I won't take that much time because we've been talking about MSU throughout. So, I think within the Department of Social Work, though, and why we chose to sponsor this piece is that aging is definitely one of the places that we have as an area of focus. We have several nationally known faculty in aging. One is involved in palliative care, and we sponsor a palliative care conference every year in social work in the spring. I would certainly invite folks to attend that. We also have a leading voice in the area of LGBTQ+ and elderly. Her dissertation focused on that, which is a very unique population, and certainly has sat at the juncture of that intersectionality in some very distinct ways. So, and we have many students who are placed in all sorts of aging related places, from the policy side to congregate care and everything in between. So we see ourselves as positioned to be of service. And I would say that that's also true across. So we have just recently formed a College of Health. So we took our College of Professions and recrafted that a bit. And so our aligned fields of health care, of nursing, of speech pathology are also all, I think, committed to providing services within aging and future employees who are age conscious. And so I think that we certainly see ourselves as a part of the solution. And we're also a great place to come to school. So for those folks who are looking for encore careers and encore opportunities, I think there are many things. An MSW, for example, can allow you to do many different things well until your 80s. So it's never too late to think about it. So that's all I'll share. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a question more out of curiosity in the work that all of you are doing, and speaking from like an advocacy perspective, how useful have you all found it to get people's personal stories, with ageism or healthcare or whatever it may be? But if consumers share what their experiences are, is that beneficial in your advocacy work?
I can start. That's absolutely one of the key tactics or strategies that we use. It's imperative when trying to advocate for a new policy or to change policy, to have people who are able to speak from a personal experience and really share their own journey with whatever that issue is. So right now we're actively talking to people about sharing their stories about the high price of prescription drugs, because we can put a fact sheet together or go to the legislature and recite a lot of data points, but the more compelling thing is going to be to have somebody sharing their personal story. And you see that all the time in the news that you read, and and so that is one thing that we really focus on is trying to find people who are willing to share that story and then helping them hone that narrative for various purposes, whether it's speaking to the media or speaking to the legislature.
Thank you for that. Janine and Christiane, have you found that to be true as well?
So so I'm going to have two hats on here, and they're actually not contradictory. So one of the things that we know from kind of the framing research is that we've got to be really careful about personal stories so it doesn't lead, whether it's legislators or media or the general public, to just think, well, it's that person's fault, right? Because we know that the default thinking about older people is, you know, they haven't taken care of themselves, they didn't save enough money. That's how the general public thinks, and members of the legislature are certainly members of the general public. But having said that, I totally agree with Adela that it's kind of like, how do we lead with, this is a systemic issue that requires systemic solutions. And by the way, here are people who can support the need for systemic solutions. One of the things that we did in this recent survey that I mentioned, and I think I told you we had a response of over 1,200 people, and we were hoping for 400 to have a statistically significant sample. We had over 1,200 people, and one of the questions we asked was, would you be willing to share your story? And keep in mind, this is about workforce, and what we have found previously is that people who are still trying to find a job are reluctant to share their stories because they're still out there, right? Over 300 people said, yes, I'm willing to share their stories, and then literally typed in really long answers into the survey form about what their stories are. So I think when we go to, you know, SAPCA, Colorado Senior Lobby, the legislature, we're going to have people who can really talk about the need for some systemic changes in the way that we're looking at workforce and age discrimination. I don't know if it's the pandemic or not, but it just all of a sudden people, I think older people are angry, and they're, I think somebody said earlier, Christiane, you said, you know, we need to use our voice, and I think people are kind of ready to use their voice. So maybe your vision of the Grey Panthers coming back may occur. We'll have to do some Grey Panther mask or something.
There's actually an exhibit in one of the galleries in Denver about masks and their creative pieces. So,
okay.
I just
or tie-dye mask, something.
Yeah. The other piece I would add is that, so SAPCA, we've been doing listening tours as a part of our gathering process since 2017, I believe. And we've been still doing it. We just hosted one in the south east piece, and we're going down to the southwest in November. And so listening to what's actually happening in communities is a really important part of keeping our work grounded in the diverse parts of our state. In terms of things are very different in each part of the state. The other place I think that stories become really important as part of our advocacy is that we actually also listen to the legislators and legislators and get their story in relationship to aging. Part of what started SAPCA was Diana Primavera, who's now Lieutenant Governor in her role as a legislator, was dealing with her own mother and her health issues and the challenges that she was experiencing. And we have found that many folks in the legislature have those stories and understand that it is a challenge. And ageism is a part of that challenge. And so tapping into how it affects, and to be honest, we've also used that with the governor. The governor has parents who are getting older, and he has used those and brought those up at various events that have been sponsored. And I think that those are important parts of stories as well, in terms of it is about the universality that we all are getting older, but we also all have family members who are getting older and experiencing different things, and we connect very quickly to the challenges of aging. It's not as difficult for people to connect to as some of the other issues out there in the world.
Thank you. So I know we're getting near to the top of the hour, but maybe just one last question, I'd like to let the audience have a chance to ask questions. So I don't know if there's anything new in the chat or the Q&A, but if you all see anything, please feel free to address that. I don't know. Rich, was there anything else in there that we
Yeah, I'm
could
trying to
bring
look
up?
at the last
Okay.
couple ones here.
Okay.
Um,
And if not, then I think it's great having all our organizations collaborating here today, and it's inspiring. And I think that together, if we all are connected, that gives power to the consumers. And hearing stories, that was affirming to hear you all say that that is definitely a beneficial aspect to moving initiatives ahead. So I'd love for the people that are watching today's webinar to take action, and we can all keep one another connected and in ways that we can do that. So is there anything else, Rich, that you saw?
I was just looking at the last couple comments. Gail had a comment about a client who's worried about getting qualified on Medicaid, and Ed is making I think, a valid point about sometimes might be tendency to think of all workforce issues as somewhat equivalent, but there can be differences depending on what your job experience has been in the past. And he's talking about, maybe for some people, a joint replacement, being able to get that is just as important, if not more so, than getting hearing aids. So we can always talk, I guess, about what are they called, enhanced Medicare or enhanced Medicaid. We can always try to do more, I think. And then Pat's added some information about her organization that provides services for dental, vision, and hearing. So if anyone wants to comment on any of those.
Just to Ed's comment, I think one of the things that early on in our work in SAPCA, and the reason that we wanted to get a voice for older Coloradans on the Workforce Development Council is that retraining folks whose careers have been more physical, which is not one you necessarily can do as your body gets beat down. And the Workforce Development Centers are there to help in the retraining. That is really part of their role. And so, but we saw that was not necessarily what they were always thinking about. And so I think that's part of the opportunity, is to allow folks to transition from a career which is heavily physically based to one that perhaps uses all the other skills and talents you've learned and repurpose those in another direction. So before you have to get to a joint replacement piece. So just that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good.
All right, since we're nearing the end, I'd love to give each of you maybe like a minute to say what you're thinking about for 2021 or 2022, like thinking ahead in the work that you're doing, what you're focusing on, and what might be helpful for all of us to know that you're getting involved with. Start with whoever'd like to jump in first. Sorry.
I was deferring to Janine since she had been going first before, but I can jump in. We're, in part planning for some proactive strategies around increasing access and affordability, both, as I mentioned already, in identifying some type of public option or public option-like plan for people in Colorado, and by trying to implement a prescription drug affordability board and some transparency legislation. I think we're also really waiting to see what happens in the elections. There are ballot initiatives that could affect the amount of revenue that the state has going forward. And then the presidential election will also impact whether we're doing more proactive work or if we're doing a lot of defensive work to maintain the structure and fidelity of the Medicaid program or the Affordable Care Act. So there's quite a bit of scenario planning that we're doing over at the Colorado Consumer Health Initiative.
Can I jump in a second real quick on that, Adela? Something that reminded me that a couple of us have talked about relative to the public option. And are you aware of any conversations about including in like the benefits that would be available under that, access to community-based services, similar to what's being offered nowadays under the Medicare Advantage plans, as a way to provide additional benefits and lower cost benefits than, you know, medicalizing everything. Has there been any talk about that, or do you think that if not, is that something that might have some merit for the public option?
I think that has the potential, that has a lot of merit. I know what we've been talking about thus far is making sure that at the bare minimum, we're mimicking the essential health benefits of the ACA regulated plans, and then going from there.
Okay, thanks.
Janine or Christiane, thinking ahead to next year and the year after, maybe?
I think what Adela said about scenario planning is just, you know, what we're all doing. And it's based on obviously local election, state election, you know, federal election. So a lot of scenario planning. The hopeful, optimistic part of me says elections will go the way I hope they will, that we will be able to be in a proactive and not in a reactive role. And I'm hoping that we can encourage, you know, more of across the state, and now this is Colorado specific, to have kind of an age-friendly lens and an anti-ageism lens when looking at potential policies, potential pieces of legislation. And we're going to be there. We're going to continue to work with the Bell Policy Center to not just react to stuff, but also to proactively put things out there, like banning, you know, Colorado was, you know, a state to ban the box, the ex-offender box. And I think we can ban, we were forward thinking then, and we can be forward thinking in being one of the first states to ban high school graduation dates on job applications. So I am choosing to look proactively while scenario planning like crazy.
Thank you. Christiane?
Yeah, and I know, I mean, we've already begun to look at what will our next year's agenda look like, and continuing to examine the impacts of COVID and the pandemic on older Colorado, and what our recommendation moving forward is going to continue to be a major focus of our work moving forward. We don't see an end to this until sometime midsummer, probably at the earliest, from everything that we're sort of hearing. So we're not looking at this being over, and that we need to continue to keep our eye on this. And as both Adela and Janine, but I mean, scenario planning, it is really difficult to look into a future that is dependent on so many variables that I think at this point it's really about what we know is that our population is going to get older, and that is going to continue. And it's, if we don't address it, the financial impact on the state will be unsustainable at a level that we haven't seen. One of the only things to increase in this past budget was Medicaid. And that should be a message that if we don't take seriously addressing the opportunity in aging, it will cost us all tremendously.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So thank you all, Janine, Adela, Christiane, for being here today and sharing all your knowledge and insight. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to hand the baton over to Kelly Roberts. She's the Vice President of Colorado Senior Lobby, and she will close us out today. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Well, on behalf of the Board of Directors of Colorado Senior Lobby, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this and the other webinars with this series. I'm pretty pleased that we really gave people a unique opportunity to have access to legislators and topic experts like the folks who are on the call today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, we hope if you aren't a member of Colorado Senior Lobby, you would consider becoming a member. I feel like the more members, the more of a voice that Colorado Senior Lobby can be for older Coloradans. Want to let you know that we will recommence what we call our legislative committee meetings that members can attend on October 19th, and those will be held every 2 weeks. We are really focusing on how to position and prioritize what we focus on as we go into the 2021 and, for that matter, 2022, with that awful economic crisis that's the reality these days. So we've got to be pretty strategic. And finally, you will be receiving an evaluation of this webinar by email, thanks to Jody Waterhouse. And again, thank you so much for attending our webinar series.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for being here.
everyone.
I think we're done.
Yes. All right. We appreciate your time.
Bye, thanks.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Very much.
Take
Nice
care.
job. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.